Hello world and all explorers out there. Today I'm gonna try to do a tutorial, and I actually saw a tutorial on Swagger using a generated Node server, and I think they used React, but I thought that tutorial was so hard to follow that I actually think I can do a better job of it. So the things I will cover today is creating a Swagger file and talking a bit about how to use Swagger and some of the documentation features of Swagger, not all of them. And then we're going to generate the server, implement the functions, and I'm going to use web components and Polymer to create my front-end client. And last but not least, we need to test it out and profit, of course. So let's start with the Swagger. What is Swagger? Swagger is a documenting format written in either JSON or YAML, where you can define an API functionality using a specific structured language. And there's a lot of tooling in the Swagger toolkit that you can use. So one of these tools is the Swagger editor that you see behind me now. And in this Swagger editor you have a left side pane where you can actually edit your Swagger file, and on the right hand side you see the actual documentation that is generated from this Swagger file. And you also get some error marking. So if we go in here and say that we remove the description, for instance, then I think it should change on that side. So you see that the description is removed. We remove the title, we get an error. The title is missing, general information about the API. So in this case we are required to have a title for the project and so on. Some of these errors are really good, so you can just browse through them and see what they actually mean. And some of them are so obscure that you need to go into the documentation and actually look at how the document should look in order to understand them at all. So I think there are still some improvements to be done with this editor, but it's a good tool if you are creating a small or medium-sized API. Then this could be a good visualizing tool and editing tool. If you go beyond, like, let's say a file of 6,000 lines, then this editor becomes really slow and sluggish because it's actually built in just pure JavaScript, and it can't handle really large files, and it actually generates a new representation every time you make changes to it. And then you can use Sublime or your text editor of choice, and there's a validator you can use to see that your document is correct. So let's jump into the code here. Firstly, we have the Swagger version number. It's just to see that we use this documentation so they know what to validate against. Then we add a version for our API, title and description. Simple things. We need a scheme and a host where this API can be found, and that is because this documentation can actually be used as a tool to try your API out during development. We're going to look at that later. And then we can say or state what kind of conversations we're going to have. In my case, I want it to consume JSON objects and produce JSON objects because I'm using JavaScript in the backend and in the front end, and that's much easier to use the same document and object structure on both sides. And then we come to paths. In my case, I'm doing a very simple nodes application, so I have only one path, or two paths, but one endpoint. And this is the node endpoints, which I have a get operation to get all the nodes, and a post operation which will create a new post or a new node. And in the get operation here, we can define responses. And in my case, I only have the simple 200, everything is okay response. You can define and describe all the errors that could occur and so on, but I haven't done that. And this is also an interesting thing that you can add if you want. And this operation ID could be used by the generators to create methods in the backend. So you can follow from the documentation to the backend what this function in your controller is actually called. But if you don't specify this, the name for this endpoint will be nodes get. And in my case, I thought it was better to get it a name, give it a name, get all nodes. But I'm not sure, and I think probably not all the generators will use this information. So some of these are optional, but could be used for better clarification. And yeah, in this post note, I actually say that the information that I will send will be in the body, and I will name that body note so I can see in the backend where the body of the request will end up. In my case, it will end up in a note variable, and the schema here goes down to the definition and describes how this JSON structure will look when it comes to the backend. And then I have a response of 201, the node was correctly created. And then I have an endpoint with an ID to get where I send in the ID, and parameters can actually be either added to one of the different methods, post or get, or it could be for the whole block. So you can say that for this endpoint node's ID, you have the parameters ID that will be in the path of the calls, and it's also required because otherwise you will not know that you actually go into this endpoint. So this is very reasonable. I'm not sure if that is actually required to specify, because it makes no sense that it isn't required. And then I will have this get information here, and here I have actually added 404. The node wasn't found, so I will describe that case, and the operation ID of get nodes by ID. And on the put, I continue to use the schema definition of node as the body, and use the ID so I know how to add things. And the difference between put and patch could be a bit controversial, but what I have understood is that a put should replace the data, and a patch should just patch data, change different methods. So a put requires that you send the full JSON document every time you change something, and in the patch case you can only send one field if you want to update the field. And then we have the delete method. Nothing strange there. Takes an ID and removes a node. So that's pretty much it. I'm not sure why I have this parameter here. That's not required. Well. So, and the last part we have down here in the definitions block, I actually just say that my node is an object and it has the properties text of type string. So it's nothing strange there. My ID is also strings. See up here, it's further up. So in this block I have parameter name ID, and then in the path it's the ID of the node, it's type string and required. So if we look over at the other side of this document, see if I can get my mouse over there, you can see that it actually had generated a documentation for me where it says that here are my nodes, it's a get endpoint and the response code, and then I can actually try this and send an information and get the response for that call if I like. And in this case it doesn't work because of cross-origin calls, because I can't actually connect to localhost from editor Swagger.io. And in my case, when I built a client outside of the actual server, I couldn't use this either, because if you do a cross-origin call, which means that you call another domain, then you are not allowed to do that with Ajax. So then you have to have a policy that defines which domains you can actually reach. So yeah, when we actually go up in this tooling, which was the next step I did, I went up here and I generated a node server, which generated a package, a zip file that I downloaded, unzipped, and it has all the required files for this server, and all the methods stubbed, so they will return only an empty response, and it has a package file. It's a standard Node.JS application, so then you just run install on it and you will have an actual server up and running. And after you have run npm start on it, you will actually have a documentation all ready for you on the docs. So your port/docs will actually give you the Swagger documentation with Swagger UI. So you can go in here, look at your documentation, look at the notes, for instance, and then try it out, get. And in my case, you can see here that I can actually get the structure of all these this information that we saw earlier in my client. So here is the data structure of my backend server. So I can actually try the endpoints out here and see that they are working before I start implementing my server. So let's go into some code then. So let's see here, if we look into the first off, the default service. So when I actually generated this call, I will end up with this node server map, and here I have the API, and that's actually just a YAML file of the Swagger documentation. And then after I created everything, they have a README, I have a license, and this index where I made one simple change for cross-origin security. And in my controllers, you have a default controller and a default service. So the default controller will actually call the default functions on the default service. So if we open up the default service as it is generated, we can see that we have documented that it expects arguments ID and note, which is defined in our Swagger definition, how a note should look, and then it responds with no value. So the API or the API UI you saw earlier, when you run it, the first time after generating, you will not get the response. You will not get any information. But in my case, I have already implemented these. But this is how they look before you start implementing them. So you have a lot of functions, and all of them return nothing. So that's a good starting point. So you can actually try each of them out and just implement one at a time. So let's see how I implemented the first call that we actually ran. And in my case, I wanted to try to use this lowDB, which uses Lodash and creates a local database, which is a simple JSON file. So if we look in my db.json here, it's just the nodes with some IDs and text that is connected to that idea. And if we go back again, I set the header, so I will return JSON. So I inform the client that here comes some JSON. I set the status code to 200. It's not required. I think it's going to be 200 anyway, but on other places in the code I use different status codes, so I think it's good to define the status code in each function to actually document what you will return. And then I stringify the response from this database. And this low database, you can actually just get a collection and then return every document in that collection by just saying that you want the value of that collection. So that was quite handy. So there's 3 lines of code implemented get everything. So that was quite nice to see, and an easy thing to implement. And then I wanted to create the post note, and then I wanted a unique ID. I looked at Stack Overflow and I found this very simple replace function that added some random values to create some UUID, so unique identifier. And then I did the same as before, created, set the JSON content type and a response code of 201, object created. And then I get my collection again and push a value to that collection. I push it with the unique identifier, and the text I set to arguments, which I will get into this function. The note, which is the actually note object. And when I get objects back in the arguments, they will have a value. So in this case, I will get args note value to get the actual value of that note. And inside of the note, I have specified that it's an object which contains the value text. So by using args note value text, I will get the actual text and set that to my database, and then return the value to result and stringify that back on my creation method. And then we have get notes by ID. Pretty much the same here. The difference we have is down here, where I will look at the look in the database for an ID. I will find an ID. So this find method takes an object with all the parameters that you want to match in order to get a record back. And in my case, I get the specific note back. So that was also easily handled. And it goes on to put, and the difference there is that you first find and then you assign with the new text. My patch is not different in this case. I do the same because I have only one value, so that's an easy implementation of the patch. And delete is the same. The difference is that I changed the find to a remove, and in this case I return 204, object removed, and an empty array. So in this case I have a working server, and I can use the Swagger UI you saw earlier and try each of the functions out. But the next step is that I want to implement a client. And in order to implement a client, which could be on another domain or another port, then I have to open up this server and add some policy to say that I'm not restricted, that a client needs to be on the same domain as the server in order to call these functions. And that is done by do a simple npm install course, and then you will get a package called course, and in this Swagger tools framework, you can just do an app use course to add course to it with no extra configuration. And with no extra configuration, you allow to call all different ports on the same domain. So that opens up all the possibilities for me on the local host to work with this server, at least. So that's what you have to do in order to get started with this. If you want to do this in a more production-ready environment, then you of course need to look into this module more and actually configure it, add some configuration to it so it will actually do the right thing. Course is very important to get right, so you have the right security for your application. So let's go back to our client here, and this is a very simple Polymer client. I only have a few different cards. With the delete function, I can type in here and it will send information to the server directly and change the backend, and I can click add note and it will create a new line in this file. So I can add some more data here, and everything is persisted and just being there without doing anything else. So let's look how I implemented this simple server. So if we look into the Polymer code here, first off, when you create a Polymer project, the first thing you do, or you can do, is get the Polymer CLI, which is a Node package, and after that you run Polymer init, and you can answer a few different questions there. In my case, I created Polymer application, but you can actually start with a starter kit, or you can start with a very elaborate example, so you have more to work with when you learn Polymer. But I have written a few Polymer applications now, so I started with a simple Polymer application. And when you start up a simple Polymer application, you will get this client directory here, and after running bower install, you get some simple components. In my case, I also did a bower install paper input, or in my case I actually did paper elements, so I get all the paper elements. And paper elements in Polymer is all the visual elements from Google that you can use to design your layout. And then I installed all the iron elements, and these elements are more of functional elements, and in my case I only use the icons. I don't know why they aren't visual components, but that's the way they have structured things. And then I also added an element called REST API, which is a custom element available at customelements.io, and that's the component that does all the communication with the server, and it's quite easy to use, so I like it, so I added that too. And that's a lot of bower installs, and after I've done those, I have those in my components directory here, and in my source directory I only have this Nodes client app, and that is initialized by this index. So we can actually take a look at that too. Yes, this index HTML is quite easy as well to understand. It's only setting up a viewport, sets a title, adds a meta description, a manifest file, and this manifest file is when you create a one-page app, you want to define all the values in the manifest file so it will install on devices and give it a nice icon and the correct background and foreground colors and so on. And then we will use the Web Components Lite to get all the polyfills for web browsers that don't support web components yet, but they are coming. And then we import our Notes application and add that to the body. So this index HTML is quite easy to understand. This Note application client is not hard either. I have all the imports for the things I spoke about earlier. We have the REST API and REST API resource. There's a difference between those. I will come to that. I use a paper input for all the inputs. Paper button, self-explanatory. Iron icon is the functionality to show an icon, and iron icons is all the icons from the material design library. And that's quite wasteful. If you want to implement Polymer with icons, you should actually pick out the icons that you want to use and create your own library with those icons. And the paper ripple, so you get the nice button effect. So here my Notes client app starts with the DOM module. And in the template, I have some styling. Those are not important. It's just to get some flex and put things on different places and so on. It's not really that much of a visual components to it. And then I create this REST API tags, and the only thing I specify here is that my my server is on the URL localhost 8080. So there's nothing more that is required in this parent element, but the REST API uses a parent element of REST API with some arguments, and then you can create resources underneath that inherits from this parent element, and then you can have resources within resources within resources as your REST API extends down the tree, so to say. And in my case, I only have one REST API, and that's Notes, and that will create the function that we go to the localhost 8080/notes. So I will handle that resource in on my server. And then I said that my ID attribute is ID. I think that is default, so it might not be important. And then I set my collection to this Notes with a double-way data binding, so I could use these notes later on. I'll create a template with the DOM repeat, which means that it will do this for every item in the items object, in my case Notes, and it will give that all of those the name Note. And then I use a paper card, and in the card content I add the paper input with a placeholder of note text, and the value is just note text. So for each note, create a paper input and add the value note. And I also set an iron icon delete, which is the little trash can that you saw on the side there. And I've set a value of a data index, and that's just so my on-tap delete note will have an index of which of the cards to remove, or the notes to remove. And last but not least, I have the paper button in the button area, which I use to add new notes. So that's the full template, everything that is required to show the GUI that you saw earlier. And now to the script, all the code. And I say that this is a Notes client app, so that's connected to this DOM module up here. So you will, in this way in Polymer, you will, with those two identifiers, you create the tag of Notes client app. So that's what that is used for. I only have one property, and that's the object of notes, which stores all the objects, all the values of the notes. And I also added an attribute of notified to those. So if the object changes, I want it to notify all in all directions. There's also one property here that you can set if you want the notification to go back to the parent object as well. But usually when you write Polymer, you want events to go down, or events to go up, and attributes to go down. So you don't want actually to notify your parent element's attributes, but you can. And then I only have two methods. I have the add note, which pushes a new note to the element array. And in my case, I also want to fetch all the notes, so I have new IDs and so on, so I know that what's in the server is the same as in the client. Might be that there's a bug somewhere in REST API which required me to add this, but yeah, if I didn't do this, I had some problems later on to add things to them because my ID wasn't set. But that's a very small fix, I think. And then my delete is just a splice on the same object structure, which will remove the element. And that's pretty much it. The nice thing with this REST API element is that you don't have to worry about all the crazy things about talking to the server and changing values and so on. Because you have a double data binding with it, it will do all the heavy lifting for you. So that's quite nice. So that's pretty much what I wanted to go through in this short tutorial. I hope that you learned something from this, and that it was interesting, and that you have a little bit more of an understanding of how Swagger works and how it looks, what you can use Swagger for when creating your APIs and document your APIs and so on. And perhaps you have some more knowledge about Node.JS or this Lodash local database, something that I don't have that much experience with, so perhaps that was not that clear. And hopefully have also seen the power of creating front ends with web components, which I think is a very neat way to create your applications. And as usual, if you like this video, give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. And I really hope to see you in the next video.